Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of the Breaking Point series. This is Fic 12 in that series, entitled Come Hang Out. Here's the summary. A look into the interactions in the dorms for the two biggest problem children. Involves interventions from the Bakusquad and the Dekusquad realizing something rather important concerning their cinnamon roll. Honestly, Izuku wasn't sure how to feel about being moved into the teachers' dorms. It was confusing and intimidating to be completely surrounded by the adults all the time. To the point where he sequestered himself into his room almost all the time the first week. It was easy since he had his own little kitchen and living room, so keeping to himself was the easier of the choices. That didn't mean he didn't go over to Heights Alliance to see his friends all the time, though. He loved seeing his friends, no matter the setting, so he spent as much time as he could there. All he had to do was tell one of the teachers that he was heading over, and one of them would walk with him and then sit in the living room with something to do and keep an eye on things, especially when Bakugo was in the room with this group of friends. It was great, just hanging out and doing homework. He was happy to be here with his friends and classmates, keeping up with gossip and any new change in their quirk or fighting style. He was even able to help with the homework for Ashido and Kaminari every now and then, especially when Bakugo was too busy doing chores for the dorms. Right at this moment, it was like the third day of both their punishments, and he was sitting at the table in the front of the sectional doing homework with his normal friend group, plus Kaminari and Ashido and Kirishima. They had received an art project from Midnight that day, who refused to give any hints on it, even though she was sitting off to the side with her own pile of paperwork. Izuku had peeked some of their tests in there, and had seen some of the grades, but he kept that to himself. So far, they hadn't gotten too far on the project, since everyone at the table excluding Izuku himself had no idea who their hero was, so they had to look up who they had. Most of the heroes they were given were along the older generations of heroes and weren't super well known anymore, having faded to time. Izuku had always been in love with heroes, older and newer ones, so had done his research on all of them at some point. So this assignment was going to be simple for him to do, but that also meant that his classmates were flocking to him for help. That included Ashido, who was now scooting closer towards him little by little with a look in her eyes that was making him nervous. "Hey, Midoriya, you know heroes really well, don't you?" she asked as she leaned towards him. Izuku gulped nervously as he leaned away from her as best he could. Uraraka was on his other side, and he couldn't lean too far without touching her as well. He wasn't really in the mood for touch at the moment, and really didn't want to deal with it. I do, he agreed easily, leaning backwards now that he couldn't lean to the side much more. The pink-haired girl was really crowding into his space, and he really wasn't appreciating it. "So," she gave a wide smile as she dragged the word out. "Do you think you could help me out with the hero I have? I have no clue the first thing about them, and I don't know how to look them up," she stated as she leaned even closer, and Izuku scooted away from the table. It was either that or hit the floor to get away. I, I don't mind helping," he said as his shoulders hunched up towards his ears. Why did the girl have to get so close to him? Why did she have to get so in his space when he was obviously not appreciative of the close proximity? But, could you please back up? He asked, hoping that would help get some of his space back. "Oh, you're going to help Mina!" Uraraka exclaimed as she wrapped her arms around his neck suddenly, leaning her upper body into his back and shoulders as her head came to lay against his ear. "Can you help me too?" He hadn't been having a good day. The lights were bright when he had woken up that morning, and his skin prickled at the clothes that rubbed at it. He knew it was a prelude to one of his normal panic attacks, but he wasn't sure if it would lead to an overload as well. Sometimes he would have sensory overloads, but they didn't always happen with panic attacks, which he thought was lucky. But he wasn't lucky enough to avoid them entirely. He still got them every now and then, and with his skin prickling, he thought he might have one coming up. That was why he had no real want or need for touch that day, avoiding it like the plague unless absolutely necessary. It was lucky that he was under punishment and so wasn't allowed part of the heroics classes, or he'd have gone over the edge long before now. But that didn't seem to register with his classmates at the moment, who were all intent on getting into his space for any reason. It was driving him further and further towards that edge, and he could already feel his skin start to spike with pain in preparation. He quickly shrugged out from under Uraraka and gathered his things, shoving them into his backpack as quickly as possible as he smiled at his friends shakily. I am gonna get my notebooks." He waved at them before hurriedly disappearing from the living room without looking back. His skin screamed with pain, of his clothes rubbing against his skin, and the lights were burning his eyes. Back in the living room, Uraraka and Mina both shared looks that were shocked and confused. "What the hell just happened?" the pink-skinned girl questioned as she turned and watched Midnight pack her things and follow the green-haired boy out. "I have no clue." The gravity girl slumped back in her seat, cheeks puffed out as she tried to figure out what had just occurred. "I don't think I've ever seen Deku ever leave us behind like that before." "He did not look quite well," Ida shot in as he waved his arms around like the giant robot he was. "He's been pale all day," Todoroki stated next as he continued to write, ignoring the looks the others shot him. "I figured if he felt bad enough he'd just go to the infirmary." "We're talking about Deku here. He wouldn't go to Recovery Girl on the verge of death, let alone a cold, Karo." Sue flipped through a book, trying to find the hero she needed to do research on as well. She really wasn't interested in getting into a friend's business unless absolutely necessary, and Midoriya hadn't looked like he wanted them to at the moment. "I mean, Sue is right, but I don't think that's what it was," Kirishima said as he worried his lip between his teeth, having to pay attention so that he didn't accidentally bite through. He had done that a few times growing up, and it was not fun to have stitches in your lips. It just seemed like he didn't want to be here. Why wouldn't he want to be here, though? Denki had a pencil balanced on his nose as he looked towards his friend. "I would think being with the teachers all the time would be boring or stressful. It's stressful during the day in the classroom, after all." "You're all fucking idiots if you don't understand why the shitty nerd left." Bakugo had bags of trash in either hand, a glare on his face and bandages that still sat on his cheeks, much like Midoriya. "Fucking shitty extras don't know shit about respecting another's fucking space," he grumbled out as he left out the front doors to dump the trash. The group of individuals sat in silence for a moment before glancing at one another. "Did Bakugo just admit to knowing something about Mido, bro?" Kirishima questioned as he looked back to where his friend disappeared. "I really don't like that," Uraraka huffed as she crossed her arms angrily. "Bakugo has no right to know Deku as well as he does." "They did grow up together, Karo." "Doesn't mean we have to like it," she hissed. All he wanted to do was hole up in his room after an entire day of cleaning the damn dorms and serving the shitty extras as they treated him like a fucking servant. It was driving him up a fucking wall, and he wanted to be separated from them for some time. But he couldn't. Deku was up in the upper echelon of the dorms, and he couldn't fucking go to his room where he was safe from the scrutinizing eyes of one snipe. He knew that he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Deku as much as possible when they were in the dorms, at least not when he could be watched by a teacher at all times when they couldn't see Deku. So, to make sure that Deku could hang out with his friends and make sure that Bakugo was nowhere near the nerd, they made him stay in the common room with the teachers instead. He'd have to wait to continue the cleaning upstairs after the shit rag left, but that was okay. That meant he could make sure the cleaning downstairs was done right in the first place. Though it didn't help his nerves one bit when a teacher always had their eyes on him. His hands sweated nitroglycerin, for God's sake. If he got it all over the dorms because he was constantly under pressure from a teacher, he could injure his classmates without meaning to. It was a terrifying prospect, but he made sure not to show it to any of the teachers who watched, and he made sure to always wipe behind him with the specialized cleaner to negate the chemicals of his sweat. That didn't make the situation any easier than it needed to be. He hated authority, ever since middle school, where the teachers were shit and he was allowed to do whatever the fuck he wanted. They never stopped any of the shit of the students, never stepped in to help the fucking weak, and they always made him feel like he was high in the food chain, more than even them. Now he was in a high school where the teachers were quick to jump his attitude towards them, and his classmates. They always stepped in when someone was being bullied. They always made him feel like a weak little boy that couldn't do shit right no matter how hard he tried. He hated feeling weak, absolutely detested it. His mother was a powerful woman that worked a good and powerful job herself, making herself rather famous in the wedding planner world and also in the fashion designer world as well. With his father next to her, the two were unstoppable. But she was not immune to her own weakness. She always felt like she could do better, and when she didn't, she felt powerless and weak. It made her depressed and exhausted in a way that Bakugo could relate to, because he did the exact same thing, except instead of getting angry and punching a bag of sand, or Izuku, she had turned to the bottle and drank herself into oblivion. That had made her anger more prevalent to her family, taking it out on a child, the weakest of the three, and making sure he stayed weaker than her. She made sure that Katsuki would always feel weaker than her. It was a feeling he carried with him everywhere, and it was a feeling that he felt right in that moment. He glared at Snipe, making sure that he knew that he hated the man and the feelings he was making the teen feel. A feeling that bubbled up in his chest and made him want to scream, making sure that the man and the other heroes knew that he wasn't weak. He growled as he ripped away from the man and instead walked over to the kitchen where he made sure some of the wipes he used were located. He needed to make sure that he didn't get his sweat all over the place, and the stare down with the fucking cowboy made him sweat more than he already was. He had a shitty day. Izuku couldn't help hate everything about his friends and his classmates that day. They were always so loud and boisterous, letting their thoughts and opinions be known, never letting another person tell them to be quiet and instead being extra loud just because. The only person who seemed to quiet his class at all was Aizawa-sensei, and that was just barely. Normally took the man growling in a low voice and activating his quirk to get a total silence, one that Izuku normally relished before the chaos started up again. He had known that morning it would be hard. His clothes were rubbing against his skin in an irritating way, and the sounds around him were much too loud. They pounded against his ears and created a migraine that made him sensitive to the lights and made the noise even worse. Thank God it hadn't been a practical heroics class that day, or Izuku would have been in utter hell. Either way, Izuku waved off his friends, telling him that he was going to head back to his dorm to study for a while on his own. With that, he made a beeline for the teachers' dorms, where he knew it wouldn't be anywhere near as loud and he'd be able to relax. It was always much quieter in the teachers' dorms. He wasn't sure if it was because they were adults and had better control over themselves or just because they preferred a calmer setting outside of their hero work. Either way, he was able to relax better there than he was at the students' dorms, and there was less noise and less people that wanted to touch him. So forgive him for breathing in a sigh of relief when he entered into the front entry hall of the dorm and shucked his shoes off. He didn't bother grabbing the slippers in his box and instead just walked straight in so that he could head to his room. "Ah, little listener, how was class today?" Izuku blinked as he turned towards the counter where Present Mike was standing, a bowl of something in his hand, obviously about to make something. "I hope that show wasn't too harsh on you and your little buddies today." Izuku shrugged as he edged towards the stairs. He liked talking with Present Mike, especially after classes were done. The man was always friendly and vibrant and knew what to say to get Izuku to laugh when they interacted in the dorms, though the teen was still getting used to seeing his teachers in normal clothes, much like how Present Mike now had his hair washed and in a bun, with black square glasses, and wearing a long-sleeved gray shirt with sweatpants. The man always dressed casually in the dorms. "It was loud today," he gave as his way of explanation. "Ah, I see. One of those types of days." The man's voice seemed to lower at the news before nodding towards the stairs. "Why don't you head up to your room? I'll bring some cookies by later. You can just chill and relax for the day. I'll let the others know to let you have your quiet time." Izuku smiled at that before nodding his head. He didn't waste time getting up to his room and just curling on his couch with his homework out in front of him, enjoying the silence with the soundproof headphones his mom had gotten him forever ago. He hardly even noticed when a plate of cookies were slipped through the crack in his door before it closed again. He was left to his own devices for the night, but Izuku didn't mind. He enjoyed it. It was the last day of his punishment, and he had just finished the last of the chores for the day as well. He was ready to go and hide in his room and not have to deal with any of the teachers and the extras' attitudes. Ever since they came back from the fucking movies and found out he was a jackass to Deku, a lot of the class had been cold towards him. Those that called themselves the Bakusquad had been the only ones that hadn't completely ignored him. Shitty Hair and Knockoff Pikachu and the tape dispenser had stuck around and would hang out with him after school ended, and he was done with his chores. Pinky had taken off and hadn't talked to him for a while now. Not after he hadn't denied the accusations. It honestly hurt that she had left like she had, but he could understand. He was a shit stain that had caused Deku a great deal of pain. He wouldn't deny that. It was past denying what he had done to the other boy. It didn't mean it didn't hurt when he lost his own friends because of mistakes he had made in the past. He guessed he understood how Deku felt now, about losing a friend or multiple friends since Katsuki's friend group had been his own. Once he had abandoned the shitty nerd, their friends had abandoned him as well. That meant he'd lost more than just Bakugo as a friend, and that hurt him a little bit more now that he thought it over. Either way, he sighed as he dragged his thoughts away from Pinky and Deku, and instead towards his bed that was now waiting for him. He couldn't wait to return to classes and to hero training. It had been a long week of doing workouts in his room that got repetitious, since he couldn't do a whole lot in such a small area. He was just about to his room when the door right next to his Shitty Hair's was slammed open. His arm was grabbed and he was yanked into the room almost violently. "What the ever-living fuck?" he roared, as he turned towards the red idiot, with the other two idiots behind him. The biggest surprise was that Pinky was in the room too. "Look, we need to talk to you, bro," Shitty Hair started, as he dragged the blonde over to his bed and made him sit on the edge, the rest of the squad standing around him with rather serious looks on their faces. We've got a lot to go over, and we don't want to stay up all night doing this. So do us a favor and shut up and listen before you start screaming, Pinky stated as she crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at him as she kicked a hip out. She looked like his mom when she was taking none of his shit, so he grumbled but stayed quiet. We're here to stage an intervention, Soy Sauce stated with a shit-eating grin. We want you to know that the shit that you've been doing isn't going to fly anymore. The insults and declarations of death, as funny as they seemed before, with the new info we got from Mito, we aren't sure you're just joking anymore. Pika Pika cut in next, his smile fading as he waved a hand at Bakugo. We want to assume that you actually think we're all friends, but, well, we aren't really sure anymore. Which, fair, he could understand that. Normally he just shouted and screamed to make sure they knew he was above them, and that he wouldn't take any shit from them. It had slowly verged into as playful as he could be as time went on, though he wasn't sure they understood that the explosions he set off now were just to dissipate some of the sweat and to make sure he wasn't going to make anyone sick. The explosions wouldn't hurt them, maybe sting or give off a little heat, but not hurt. Not to mention the blast that you slam into Kiri all the time. She placed a hand on said teen's shoulder with a growl. You could hurt him and not give a shit, like you did with Mito, I'm sure. He winced at that, as he glared at her. Fucking shitty hair was never in any real danger ever. Between his hardening and Bakugo's own weakened blast when he did attack, he would have no damage at all. To think that the idiot was weak enough for his own weak attacks to hurt, well, that was insulting to him. Which seemed to catch the redhead's own attention. Hey now, I have no problems with those, especially since he isn't going full strength with them anyways, he stated before turning back to the blonde. Though, that doesn't excuse the fact that you do that, and if it was anyone else, well, the damage could be bad. Yeah, man, you've left me with burns before, the other blonde waved his hand. Did they fucking scar? He questioned with a growl, knowing already that they hadn't. That's not the point, Pinky shouted as she stepped forward. It doesn't matter if it's scarred, or if we didn't take offense, or if no one was actually hurt in any way. The fact that you act like this and think it's okay just to spit and throw abuse around like this is the problem. I don't fucking abuse any of you shitty extras. He slammed to his feet as he met the pink girl's eyes full on. I don't throw anything at anyone that they can't damn well handle. Except you don't know what they or us can handle, she screamed as she got right into his face. You don't know everything we've been through, or the trauma we carry, or the pain of our past. Whoa, okay, Mina, I think he gets it. Shitty Hair tried to pull her out of his stunned face, but Bakugo already knew that she would not be moved from her place in front of him, slamming him with facts that he hadn't considered before. No, I don't think he does, or he would have thought of this shit long before he started calling us by those stupid degrading nicknames, she shot at him with a frown. Before he started treating you like a punching bag, like those jackasses in middle school did. That made the blonde turn to the redhead in shock. He could never imagine the sunshine child of their group being bullied by anyone. He was always so strong and capable, and so he didn't think his actions would reflect anything he had already been through. Though that did prove Mina's point in a startling way. He hadn't known anything about any of the group that called themselves his friends, nothing at all, and yet he dared to yell and scream and make fun of them. Like a bully. He let his head fall forward, and his hands turned to fists before he shoved them into his pockets. He hadn't really changed from when he was in middle school. Not at all. Mina, I know that, but we can't just scream at him like this. It won't help anything. Kirishima said, as he pulled the girl away from him, creating a distance he hadn't realized he needed. Yeah, well, maybe it'll get through his stupid spiky skull, she grumbled as she crossed her arms once more and hunched her shoulders up to her ears. Yeah, but screaming isn't going to do anything. Sero used a pinky to dig earwax from his ear as he gave the troublesome blonde a bored look. He's so stuck up and stubborn in his ways, might take more than just this one intervention to really get him to listen. He huffed as he glared at the black-haired teen. No, I heard Ashido loud and clear. That made the group pause as they looked at him in shock. He actually knows my name, she blinked in surprise. He gave her a deadpanned look and a shrug of his shoulders. Fuck yeah, I do. I know everyone's names. Just didn't think it was worth using them. Seems I was wrong about that. That got the group to smile. It seems that this intervention actually worked, Kaminari cheered as he waved his hands around with a bright smile. Hell yeah, it did. Sero held his head up and accepted the high five from his shorter friend with glee, sharing one with a just as excited Mina. The blonde huffed and shook his head. It wouldn't fix everything that he had done since the start of the year, but he figured this would be a start. Come on, you idiots, let's watch a movie, he suggested as he turned towards the door, ready to lead them down to watch a movie and relax. He smirked at the cheers behind him. He was getting ready to absolutely scream. He loved his friends. They were always so great to him and always gave him the love he absolutely desired for so long, but most of them had no real concept of personal space at all, except for a select few, those being Todoroki, Tokiyami, Koda, Tsu, and Ojiro. It had been a very simple day, and it was all going rather straightforward when they had decided to just enjoy themselves in the common room, playing video games and enjoying the snacks that Sato and Tsu had made that day. A release from school and all the hard assignments and exams they had to take. Some of the others that were waiting for their turns, at the games or just watching, were all lounging around as they watched the goings-on with amusement or impatience, depended on which of the two you were, waiting or just watching. Everyone was chatting with each other, while the others playing were all screaming at each other to get the hell out of each other's way or about cheap shots. Who knew Mario Kart could get so violent? Either way, even with Bakugo screaming his head off after he got blue-shelled by Shoji of all people, Izuku was enjoying himself on one of the beanbag chairs that was off to the side of the sectional. This way, he could still talk and interact with his classmates, but he had a space that was his own, especially if he needed to make sure he had his own space to stay calm. Crowded spaces still made him nervous, especially after his interaction with Shigaraki at the mall, having been so crowded with so many civilians, and he was left stuck in the middle of it all, with a hand wrapped around his throat. Making sure he had space to escape or move around had become a rather vital action as of late. Either way, it was a relaxed and exciting atmosphere, contradictions that worked with his class just about anywhere they went. He was enjoying it, was leaning back into his beanbag as he watched with contentment, giving his input into the conversation that Ida, Uraraka, and Todoroki were all having on the couch next to him. Tsu occupied another beanbag chair that was about a yard away from him, and was enjoying Uraraka braiding her hair behind her. So peaceful that he was just about ready to fall asleep in his beanbag. Until a scream ripped through the air and a body slammed into his own as hands desperately scrabbled at his limbs. He panicked and tried to get out from underneath the other, as his quirk acted up, blessedly rolling whoever off of him and onto the floor where they scrambled to climb onto Tsu instead. "What the hell was that for, Ashido?" Bakugo growled as he and the rest of the class stared at the pink-skinned girl. "There's a spider!" she screamed as she pointed at the coffee table where she had been sitting waiting for a turn at the game. "Are you serious? You screamed over a spider?" Jiro raised a brow at the other girl, even as she shook her head. "Koda, can you take care of it for us? I don't think it's right to hurt it since it hasn't hurt us." The shy boy nodded his head as he walked over and held his hand out to the spider, whispering to it. Since the exam with Present Mike, his fear of insects and spiders has lessened greatly, and it had become one of his greatest weapons. "Well then, since that's been taken care of, I'm going back to beating the shit out of everyone here," Kaminari declared as he turned back to the game. "What the heck, Bakugo?" "You snooze, you lose, Pikachu." The smirk sent the other's way was wide and shit-eating. Izuku ignored the conversation that continued on and instead allowed himself to lower down into the beanbag chair once more, his entire body shaking from the scare and the scream. It left his ears ringing and his body tingling in a way that he knew would be hard to come down from. If something else happened, he'd probably hit a sensory overload again, and that was something he wanted to keep quiet for a while yet. Which wouldn't matter if he screamed in frustration at that moment, but he kept himself from doing so just for prosperity's sake. He sits there for several moments before a voice brings his attention away from the way his skin tingles uncomfortably. "Midoriya-chan, do you want to head back to your dorm, Kero?" Sue questions as she looked at the boy with the tilted head. "You do look quite pale. Maybe retreating for your health would be best," Ida agreed as he pushed his glasses up. "Rest would do you well in any case. I'm unsure of whether you've been getting enough sleep or not." "We would understand if you need to step away, Deku," Uraraka stated with a serious look on her face. "We know how loud the dorms can get sometimes, and how you like the quiet at times." Todoroki nodded his head along with the others, giving Izuku one of his patented blank stares that held a caring hint in his eyes. Izuku took a shaky breath before shaking his head with a shy smile on his face. Yes, his friends could be loud and chaotic to the point of making him want to scream. That was something he had known for a long time. But they were also caring and understanding and knew exactly what he needed when it came down to it. So instead of getting up and leaving like he would have just a few days before, he instead snuggled down into the beanbag chair and looked at the four closest of his friend group. "Nah, I think I'll stay here." He would enjoy his friends' presences for as long as possible before he retreated back to his dorm in the teacher's building. After all, they were his friends, and he owed them his time and presence so they could continue to have each other's backs. His skin fucking itched all over as he sat at the kitchen table with several notebooks, books, and paper spread out in front of him. Kotsky had been working on his shitty homework for some time now. The Bakusquad, having decided to take a break about 15 minutes ago, had disappeared outside, lazy assholes that they were. He, however, wasn't one to shirk his godforsaken work and had decided to continue until he was completely done. And since Deku was in the building with his friends up in Sonic's room, he was stuck down here so that the teacher on duty, Aizawa this time, could make sure the two didn't run into each other by accident without supervision. It meant that he couldn't go up to his room since the hobo was too lazy to follow him up and do his damn job. Which was whatever. Fine. He could survive a while down in the living room and kitchen under the watch of the one least hated teacher he had. It helped that Aizawa didn't always have his eyes on the blonde, knowing that the teen wouldn't dare try and disappear while the other problem child was out of sight. It made this a whole lot more bearable at the moment, until he realized that he needed a book that he had left up in his room for an assignment from the hobo himself. He cursed under his breath as he tried to remember what exactly was in the text so that he could avoid asking the other to allow him up to his room long enough to get said book. Only he already knew Hobo wouldn't allow it, so he had to figure something out to get what he needed. He looked up over at his friends' things, hoping they had the crappy book lying around, but it was nowhere to be seen. That was fucking out, so he stood up and walked to the living room and looked at the few extras in there doing homework. None of them had that goddamn book either, which was fucking annoying and was driving him damn well nuts. He grunted as he walked back over to the kitchen table and slumped in his chair, running his hands over his face. He wanted the pressure to go away, to just have his book in his hand so he could do his shitty-ass homework, be done with the fucking assignment already. It was literally the last one he needed done, and while it wasn't due for a week yet, he wanted it done and out of the way. He fucking hated leaving shit to the last minute and strived to have it complete long before the due date. He groaned to himself and resigned himself to just waiting until Deku left to go and get the damn book. Bakugo. Do you need something? He startled and just about jumped out of his chair with a snarl on his face, but reeled himself back in. He couldn't continue to allow his entire being to run by instincts and anger fueled by fear. So he took several deep breaths, just like that fucking mutt had advised before turning to look at the hobo, that now stood off to the side of him. "What's it to you?" he questioned, eyes narrowed. He might have been able to control his anger, but that didn't mean his suspicious behavior was the same. Teachers always wanted something from him before, whether being named as a supporter of him in school when he became a pro or other such favors. They never didn't want something in return for their help. So he waited to see what this one wanted, though he had to admit, Obo-sensei hadn't asked for a single thing but for his students' improvement, both as heroes and as their own person. It was startling to have a teacher like the hobo, but also a breath of fresh air. "I don't care much for angsty teenage drama in the kitchen. If you need to get something from your room, just ask." The man nodded towards the elevator before turning to walk over to it. "I'm not going to disrupt your learning over something as simple a fix as this." Bakugo huffed as he followed his teacher, hands shoved into his pockets as he hiked his shoulders up to his ears. He would never admit it to the man, but he was thankful that he had at least one teacher in this entire shitty school that never made him feel inferior in any way. All right, listeners, this concludes Fic 12 of the Breaking Point series. Fic 13 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this, and as always, thank you so much for listening.